thanks for having me. This is kind of a last minute thing, so this is going to be kind of fun. This is a presentation I gave earlier in the year, so we're just going to run through it, see how we do. So my name is DJ Eshelman. I am that consulting guy who wrote that book that used to do that thing. And yeah, I'm here in Nashville in the US and am a CGC leader here. The usual alphabet soup and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, what I'm really passionate about is making sure that I see people succeed. And so that is a big driver for what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to be kind of giving some observations and some things that I've found over the years and pepper that with some personal opinions. You know, we love opinions around here. So first off, what a methodology is this for you? And this is what this is going to be like. So, I mean, thinking about, okay, how many people do you have on your services team? Is it just you? If you have multiple people, then you probably need to be paying attention here. As far as your team goes, curious how many of them have joined in the last maybe 6 months. Maybe this is for you. If anyone has left your team in the last 6 months, this might be for you. If you have concerns about how long it takes for new people to actually learn to, or learn the ropes, as we say here in the US and probably elsewhere in the world, how long does it take for people to learn how to work in your environment? And how well can you explain what you're doing to management? In other words, if management hasn't been trained to learn your vernacular, how well can you actually explain what it is you're doing? Same thing with sales. Can you explain this to your salespeople, especially for those of you that are in IT services that are part of a managed services team or anything like that? How well can you explain your process? And bruh, do you even have a process? So these are the answers. These are the questions that I've been kind of bringing up with a lot of people lately and kind of formulating a lot of the responses. And honestly, I really was surprised that any of this needs to be taught at all until I realized that about, oh, I'd say 10 years ago, before I started becoming a consultant, I couldn't have answered these questions either. And so that's why I think everybody needs a methodology. And we're going to go through a kind of, first we're going to start with a tragic tale. And this is actually from the names have been changed to protect the innocent, obviously, but we're going to tell a real world migration story here between two different companies. And it was the same basic thing on both sides. You had a team full of veterans and new hires that have just started. You had a goal to migrate a Citrix XenApp 6.5 to Zen Desktop 7.15 LTSR. Pretty common thing, right? Their methods was what I call squeaky wheel IT. And what squeaky wheel IT means is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In other words, maybe you have an agenda today, but maybe somebody else is making a lot of noise. And so you go with the one that's making the noise instead of your own agenda today. And that's what squeaky wheel IT is. The proposed timeline for this sounds reasonable. It was supposed to be done in 7 days. Well, it actually took 180 days. There was actually some break in between. So technically it was 210 days that actually took to get this project started. So it was supposed to be 7 days. From a technical standpoint, from a deployment standpoint, 7 days worth of work. It took 210 days to actually complete the project with 180 days of work. So what was their budget for this? None. You know, it was a 7-day thing that was supposed to be done internally. It was an easy thing. So they had no budget. What it actually cost was well over $75,000 just to do this little migration. So the question is, what was the business impact of this? Even more expensive. We had, well, they had several $100,000 US that were lost in this process because their staff was unable to work. And in this particular case, staff work actually was benefiting just impacting the bottom line. So it was a big deal. So the results, kind of obvious, right? So this is what we're trying to avoid today. We want to make sure that this is not our result. We don't want to get fired just because we know the technical stuff, but our process is such that it will actually lead to us having that massive failure. And so this is where a methodology comes in. Methodology is a predictable standard of accomplishing goals. So that means that you're establishing the order at which work is done. You're looking at the if it's a predictable process, in other words, you're not just kind of going with whatever you feel like in the moment, it's actually a predictable process that people can follow. And it's understood and recognized by everybody that's actually working on the process. And you've probably seen things like this before. And you might have seen a thing like that where it's like a DevOps cycle, and there's some words in there that make some sense. And you may have seen like an agile process where you're really concerned with release and launch and things like that. Or you might have the classic ITIL services mismatch of terms that, you know, seems really cool. Well, the problem is, how many can explain to their sales team what this looks like, and how many can explain it to their management what this looks like in a way that they'll actually give you the resources you need, the time you need, anything like that? Usually that's not the case. And so what you have is here a risk when you have an undesirable outcome that is possible because of what you're doing. That's what a risk is, right? So I've often referred to these as resume generating opportunities. In other words, you have the opportunity now, thanks to your actions or inactions, to generate yourself a resume because you're going to need it because you're going to be fired. Or when your system itself does harm or fails to prevent harm. This is a traditional way of describing risk, whether that's physical, emotional, financial, hitting productivity, that sort of thing. You can kind of see here that this is your classic eye-washing station here that is set right beside some nice risk here. So it seems like a good design, but it's risky. And I have a history of every time I present at E2UVC, I have some sort of clever picture. I forgot the picture of the exit through the indoor kind of thing, or the push for the pull door this time, but so this will have to do. So what's the problem here? The problem is that what I'm talking about are hidden risks. When your team has a different way of doing it than the other team does, or your process is so convoluted and so complicated that nobody knows what the heck is going on. And what it causes is unannounced changes, workarounds that people do to get around the process because it's so freaking complicated. Honestly, complexity adds risk, and that's what I always want to avoid. So your goal should be to risk less. Explain things less, risk less. In other words, you're going to adopt a method that everybody's going to understand. Not, I call this kind of do what I want ops. It's kind of the way I've seen a lot of teams handle what they call DevOps. It's not DevOps at all. It's whatever the frick I feel like today. It's like, gosh, what I feel like. It's really not scalable, because if you're not there to execute in your specific way, then it's not going to work. And this is something that IT people, we have to really recognize, that these things are real, and that we sometimes are part of that. Where if the well, we say that if the bus hit us, would the process go on? And a lot of times we have to admit that no, that probably wouldn't. And it's not because of what we know, it's because of the way we're enacting it. So if you're a consultant and you can't explain to the teams well enough, that's a risk. If you're an engineer and you can't explain it to management, that's a risk. If you can't declare a way that you do things without a business justification for doing so. In other words, I've seen a lot of teams lately that really don't need all that much of a complicated process declare that they're agile, and they can't support an agile way of doing things. They just simply can't. That's a risk, because there's no business justification for you using that kind of methodology. And so that is why I'm focusing on this, what I call the riskLESS services methodology. And it's just basically a framework. It's flexible. You can use this wherever you want. I try to keep things very simple, and what I'm doing here is just 4 iterative goal-based phases that are, when I say iterative, that means it goes in a circle. So what you have first is just the fact that you want to understand what's going on. That's the goal. Now, you can call that like things that are part of that, like assessing or just business planning and things like that, recognizing a need, surveying, whatever you call it. Ultimately, the goal is to make sure you understand. The next goal you should have after you do that is actually to plan. I feel a lot of people make the mistake of assuming they have a good enough understanding and they just rush into an engineering process without actually having a plan ahead of that and thinking through it and saying, okay, are we introducing any risks by doing this? Did we cover all our bases? Is there anything else we need to consider? These kind of classic things that happen in like design processes often need to be put into just day-to-day processes as well. So then you go into a mode of changing, right? You're going to actually go through the process of changing what you're doing. And that's pretty straightforward. A lot of times we call this deploy and things like that. But like I said, these are goal-based words that we're using here. So our goal is to make a change, hopefully a positive one, but nonetheless, it's a change, right? So the next thing we do is actually go into a phase of maintaining. In other words, again, that's the goal. We want to maintain what we have, what we built, make sure it's steady state. So what happens if we need to make a change out of this maintain phase, for example? So we're here, everything's good, but we find, oh, well, we have a Windows update, for example. Gosh, that never happens. So what do we need to do? We need to actually make sure we understand what the updates are and what the implications are. We do a plan for a rollout. We actually do the rollout, and then we're back to steady state. It's a simple process, but if we don't go through this, then we're introducing risk. Hopefully that's straightforward enough for people. But this actually happens in bigger projects as well, where let's say that you're going along with XenApp 6.5, and then all of a sudden Citrix just decides that, gosh, maybe you shouldn't be running things that are 15 years old, and you have to go through a process of actually making sure you can run your stuff. We're going to run through this in a minute of just some of the ways that this plays out if you don't have this kind of a process in place. So, and if at any point this is unclear or anything like that, feel free to pop a message in the chat box or whatever method we could use to get questions out to me. I'm happy to answer them. So again, this is all iterative, and sometimes, let's say, for example, you're going through a process and you're getting into the change part of this, and you find a risk. You know, gosh, this never happens, right? Where we actually have a update or something like that that breaks something else. Well, then we restore that. Well, instead of just saying, okay, we're back to it, now what we're doing is we're coming back to, okay, we didn't identify all the risks during our plan phase. So we come back and understand it more fully and say, okay, we have these use cases with this update. What are the implications? We plan through that again, do any kind of testing, and then actually roll it out, that sort of thing. That's the way that works as an iterative process. So when it comes to the understand phase, the goal really is to be able to speak confidently to these needs, really understand that why, or why do we do things the way we do? Why should we do it? For example, can everybody use a thin client? Maybe not. There might be some implications there. Should everything be in the cloud? Maybe not. There's implications with all these things, and if we don't understand fully, then we're introducing risk. And so this can look like a lot of different things. In information technology, it can look like vendor requirements, looking at past processes and that sort of thing for past risks. I personally like things like assessments and interviews, and actually not just taking the tools at face value, actually getting in with users and saying, okay, what actually do you do here? Do the Bob moment. What is it you do here? And actually figuring out what their workflows are, and if you have any risks in that, but also determining what their needs actually are. And so this is really useful not only for sales, but also for consulting as well, and even for IT, honestly. But honestly, the output typically is a discussion, a presentation, sometimes a document that defines kind of those success criteria. What are we looking for? What does success look like? When it comes to planning, your plan phase is making sure that everybody understands the steps that you're going to take, right? It seems simple enough, but this is where I see the most organizations trip up, is that their plan is just to do it, right? Which sounds great, but if you don't have a good process that you're explaining, you could learn into things like, oh, actually, we were doing a network upgrade that day. Are you sure we want to do it that way? Making sure we're taking all these things into effect or into consideration when we're doing these things. So we know the steps that are taken: who, when, why, how. All these questions are being asked. So a lot of times this will look like whiteboarding sessions if you're doing like a design kind of a plan. You might have meetings. I know everybody loves meetings, but sometimes they are a necessary evil, I guess. But it might look like, if you're a consultant, for example, you might have certain things like statements of works or conceptual design documents or a project plan, or even sometimes a full document of saying, here's everything you need to be successful, that sort of thing. In sales, this might actually look like, okay, based on your needs, I think you need this. So here's a bill of materials or a forecast or whatever that looks like. The point is that we're making sure that everyone understands. And so we do this in a way that say, okay, now that we have the understanding, here's the plans for everybody. And that's simple enough. I mean, it really is whatever process works for you. I find that actually writing things out and having a document, frustrating as that can be at times, actually prevents a lot of the problems down the road. So that is absolutely what I recommend taking the time to do. Now, when it comes to change, this is the part that comes the easiest to the majority of the people that are on this worldwide awesome event. Honestly, this is the stuff that we live for. This is the stuff we get into, vast majority of us. These are the things that are, it's like, okay, we're going to execute on the plan now. We're going to actually make the technology do what we intend it to do. And this can have a bunch of different methods for a lot of different companies. Sometimes you have multiple things going on at once. Sometimes you have just a single project that's going on. It really depends. But if you follow your plan, then you can get a good procedure. The key here is to have a good methodology when it comes to actually deploying things, and saying, just because I've done my due diligence in planning doesn't necessarily mean that I have every risk covered. And so we are going to do everything we can to reduce those risks. And we're going to talk about that in a second here. But if you need to return to the understand phase, that's certainly flexible. And that's something you need to communicate to management, that you want to have that flexibility to do. If you don't do that, then there's risks you have of, can you actually deliver what you want to do in a chaotic environment like EUC? Maybe not. So the output really is these things that are the changes that are done as documented. If there's not as documented, then you make changes to those documents. If you're part of that sales process, your deliverable is donuts. You deliver donuts, okay? Or pizza in this case, I guess. Beer, it's not always looked on quite well by management, but and sometimes it is. But anyway, honestly, the output here of the change is now we have a stable system that actually met our requirements. So here's what I was talking about as far as the change phases. So we have the phases down here. So we have, dev. This is really where it's just IT involved. It might even be just one person or 1% of the population that's really exposed to this. And so your risk is really high because you don't have any real notion of what the impacts are going to be here. So your risk, 100%. So you want to keep this population as low as possible. So this line here is population. This line is the level of risk. So once we've gone through our initial development, and I'm going to silence Slack because that is driving me crazy. Hopefully you guys can't hear that at all, but they're getting chatty on us here. So the notion here is that we do some things development-wise, and then we say, okay, I'm going to put this in front of the IT team to test out and validate. Again, it's IT teams. They're not going to be, grumpy at you if it doesn't work. They're going to say, man, this isn't working right. Maybe you should adjust this, or need to look at this article, or whatever it is. So we're expanding the population a little bit, but not including a lot of people that are in production. But our risk is going down because we're actually going through the process of making sure this is working properly, right? So then we go into a process of saying, okay, you know what, we think this is probably ready for release, but let's go ahead and test it against a specific group of people. A lot of times this is called user acceptance testing. Sometimes it can have different names. Just for the sake of argument, we'll just say user acceptance testing. So these are the group of people that are going to be trusted enough to say, okay, if all goes bad here, you're going to communicate back with us and just restart your regular process, okay? It's not going to be the end of the world. You're just going to be communicating with us if the design is actually meeting with our goals here and not breaking anything else. So with that, UAT really should be as much of exposure to regular processes as possible in a controlled manner, where you're controlling the people, not necessarily the process part of that. So rely on managers and things like that to tell you who is a good fit for that. But then we go into a pilot. By this point, our risk is really low. We've identified anything here, and if we needed to go back to development, we have. So this is actually, and hopefully this is not new for people, but let's just say it like it is. Sometimes people just rush right to production and do our testing there. Microsoft. So anyway, kidding. As far as the risk level, much lower, but we're starting to increase the population. And our goal here is to see for sure, are there any other use cases that we either haven't considered, anything that's popping up as far as incompatibilities, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we want to make sure that that's covered. So when it comes to going into production, we want all the population with none of the risk. And I've heard people in my life say that that's not possible, and I trust you. I will say, trust me, it absolutely is. Now we go into maintain. So we're steady state, we're good to go. Now our goal is to actually maintain what we've built. And so really there's two things with this. One is to make sure we're at steady state as often as possible, or always. So we're monitoring that sort of thing, ensuring stability. But we also need to be very aware of future changes that are being made. We don't want to assume that it's like the car with the hood welded shut. That's not the way this works. Needs change all the time, especially now in our much more cloud-aware world, where we have releases every quarter of pretty much everything we're using. Gosh, things are changing rapidly, but our needs are changing just as rapidly as our software is, and we need to be aware of that. So we do regular reviews against those baselines to say, okay, are we actually performing like we thought we were? Are we meeting the goals still? Are there new goals? That sort of thing. So in IT, this really does mean proactive monitoring. And this is where, well, I'm not going to call out anybody specifically, but let's just say that we have somebody here that's been a big help to me. Let's put it that way. There's somebody here with us that's been just that kind of a company. So I like this kind of stuff where there's good stuff that's helping me see what isn't obvious to me right on the periphery, that's going deeper in and saying, you know what, you might want to consider this. This last update, it had a little bit of more CPU. You might want to consider either doing something or upping your CPU for the resources, that sort of thing. The kind of things that monitoring does for us. And so as far as that goes, that's usually pretty common. The maintain phase also has an element of rollout too. So if you are steady state, you're not making any further changes, you're just rolling it out. That also has some implications here, especially if you're in like a consulting or sales type role, that you're supporting that and doing things like that. If you're in a consulting kind of role or that style, you'll often be called on to do like health checks or assessments and things like that to make sure that the goals are actually being still met by the environment. That's where this comes into play here. And if you're in sales, again, bring the damn donuts. It's your job now. I'm kidding. But it's kind of true though. The more you can care for people and just maintain that relationship, that's the same kind of thing. And so a lot of these things can be used outside of the services. That's just a mentality that you can use with a lot of different things. But the honest truth is here, what we want is to make sure that we actually have all the performance that we wanted. We have all the expectations being met. We're not seeing any people that are doing a lot of workarounds to get their work done. We just have a good, well-running environment that minimizes the amount of changes we have to do that disrupt anything. So my lesson here is to never fear iteration. You always want to be willing to go back if you need to. So if you need to go, back into these other phases, this is kind of a pride thing. We don't want to assume that our plan is just so rock solid that it's just going to work and we just kind of force it through. We don't come back and reevaluate. We just, say deal with it kind of thing. I hear that minimum viable product kind of thing coming up every now and then. And sometimes that's not what we need here in IT services. IT services are usually held to a different kind of a standard than even software. And so we need to be aware of that. And it's not failure if you're improving the overall product, even if that means more time. There's this concept called Kaizen, which is continuous improvement. That means for us being willing to stop a process if we have to and go back to make it a better process. And where this kind of differs from the typical, I don't think this is necessarily written this way, but the way it ends up being in a lot of companies when they're trying to be agile, delivery is not the end here. We always want to be iterating. We're IT services, that sort of thing. We're not necessarily saying, well, this is the software, this is the way it's going to be deployed. We'll see you in 5 years when you need more software. You know, we're not doing that. We're actually making sure that the needs are being met and maintained properly until the next improvement comes up. And likewise with DevOps, which is a very similar process, we're making sure that this is a process that can be handed off to someone else without having to, spend 3 years and get all sorts of certifications and do all this kind of stuff. We're just making it very, very simple for them. So even if there's micro iterations of that, we're still doing it. So the key here is making sure that everybody speaks the same language. And this is kind of cool because we're doing this in a worldwide event. We have all sorts of countries and languages represented. It means that, okay, we had to standardize, right? We had to say, well, we have to do this in something. So English is the choice for this, right? So it might be difficult for some people to understand, especially people that talk really fast like I do. But this is the language we chose for this event. And honestly, your methodology in information technology should be exactly the same kind of way, right? Where you're saying that sales can actually describe the consulting process. And this is normally the point where I ask for a show of hands and things like that. Obviously, it's not as effective here, but the honest truth is, I think a lot of us have been in these kind of situations where we're thrust into a situation that was sold to the customer, but the sales process has no idea what we're actually able to deliver. This process hasn't been followed in terms of getting the need and the plan. It's just here's what we're going to do. So integrating a process like this at the last few companies that I've been part of that have been willing to do it anyway, meant for more sales because we were actually being effective, much better statements of work that were actually, a little scary because a lot of times they were actually more expensive than what they were trying to put forward. But if you do it right, then the customer is actually very much happy with the result and very much willing for the next one too. So the main thing here is less customer complaints about their missed expectations. They're more likely to trust you in the first place, which is, when it comes to sales, know, like, and trust is king, right? When you're an IT project leader, this is the ability to identify all these multiple people that might be working in these various projects. You might have 5 different projects going on at a single time. If you can't see from a bird's eye view where people are at in a process, you won't know when it's time to bring someone else into another process to help out. You won't know when it's time to say, wait, we need to stop this one or slow this one down because it's going to run into this one. Those kind of things are going on as far as multiple changes at the same time, that sort of thing. But honestly, I think most IT managers would agree that one of their primary goals outside of their department is to decrease frustrations from users. I mean, that's usually the thing I hear the most. And so this is a key for us all to remember, that if we take shortcuts and don't follow a good, smart process, then we're going to have frustrated users. But the other thing is being able to explain this. If you're an IT manager or a project leader even, you're going to get these questions. And so if you can't explain this in kind of non-technical terms a lot of the times, then it's going to be frustrating for other people involved. And so making sure that we have this involved. So I wanted to give you a quick rundown of what this often looks like when it comes to these micro iterations that I kind of brushed on briefly. So a lot of times, as far as the understand process goes, pretty straightforward. We're figuring out what the why is or what the success criteria is and looking at risks. We're planning and doing that sort of thing. But here's where I think a lot of companies still to this day miss their what they should be doing and just roll. They think they have a plan, they just roll right into production. But when I'm talking about micro iterations, I'm saying, okay, we do the change process, we do a little bit of development, and we change our test lab, for example. That's what we're changing, quote unquote. And we're validating this with various departments. We're making sure that this isn't breaking anything more. And if we have to come back, then we do. If it's something where if we go forward, then we just kind of say, okay, let's go back to the understand phase real quick and make sure that everything is validated, that we're all good. And then from that point, we go on into user acceptance testing. And from that point, like I said, try to keep it to about 10% of the population. Usually, this will vary on a lot of companies, but I find that as a general rule, that works pretty well. So 10% tends to work pretty well. But arrange that ahead of time, and there's a whole lot of strategies that I'm outlining in a future presentation, future book kind of thing, on some strategies that I've used to actually incentivize these teams that have actually worked really well. So that's something that is kind of cool. But anyway, as far as that goes, there's obviously the actual rollout. And so when you go to that change and actually make the change in the UAT environment, roll it out, you go back and reevaluate just into the production phase. Say, okay, is there anything we need to change here? If not, we're good. How do we monitor this? How do we gather feedback? Is the expectation matching? Do we need to have more VMs or whatever, that kind of thing looks like? And then we actually do a production rollout plan. And this is actually where a lot of companies miss a lot of these steps, as far as, like, obviously you usually have things like change control, hopefully, but the communication to users and leadership, this is where I think IT kind of tends to fall flat on its face. We don't think in terms of like marketing. We don't think in terms of like even advertising in that way, so, but we need to. We absolutely need to. Actually, Jeff Pitch and I had a conversation about this recently, and he had a cool video that we can get you a link for. I'm pretty sure it's on LinkedIn for sure, and YouTube, that sort of thing. So we've had these discussions, and I think they're awesome, because we need to be thinking more in these terms if we're going to be, successful. Good communication. Hear me on this. Good communication is absolutely what leads to promotions. This is what leads to raises right here, is communication. It's not the stuff or the technical stuff you're doing. This communication is actually the key here. So hear me on that. But anyway, when we're going into the change process, we're doing the same kind of thing. We're getting this pilot rolling, and if we need to go back, we absolutely do. If we need to extend our time frame, we absolutely do. Now is the time to determine if something's not going to work right. But in most cases I've ever seen, if you've followed this process, the odds of needing to go back after a pilot are really, really small. But we always want to make sure. And so, does it take more time? Yes. Is there complications along lines with this? Yes. Is it worth it? Abso-freaking-lutely. So, the maintain phase, you're monitoring for additional risks. You're making sure you're documenting your process, document what you did. You're probably not going to be here in 6 months, and if 6 months comes around and you're still here, you're probably not going to want to remember it anyway, so freaking document what you did, all right? Just do it. And gathering feedback, that's another thing that we're often afraid to ask users, for example, what they think or what they need. But these are actually things you absolutely need to be doing. All right, we have time. I think I'm going to have some fun here. All right. I'm going to tell you a tale of 2 migrations. These are both true stories. I changed the names to protect the innocent, obviously, but like I said, the idea was to do a 2008 to 2016 migration, XenApp 6.5 to LTSR 7.15 at the time. The usual stuff. Throw in a hypervisor upgrade just because fun, and a storage upgrade just because, well, I mean, we're already doing all this other stuff. Why don't we just do that as well? So here's how it went. So we had one place that did it well, and then they had a good rollout. So here's what they did. Day one, they sat down and had actual stakeholder meetings. They actually made the hard effort of actually getting people in a room and saying, what do we want to achieve? We're not making any assumptions here. What do we actually want out of our environment? That sort of thing. They actually did a straight up assessment of their actual existing infrastructure. They had meetings and decided, okay, here's what this is going to look like. Did this for a week, okay? Made sure that everybody, had a good understanding, and then actually, because the things went so well with this particular group, they were actually getting into the plan phase a little bit ahead of schedule. They had a solid plan going within the first week, and testers are defined, all this kind of great stuff. So right into the next week, they said, okay, well, we've got a ability to do this. Let's actually set up a test environment that's got a development wing to that test environment. So they did that. They just mirrored as much as they could as their existing environment into this. So they installed the VDAs and did all this kind of stuff. In this case, they actually did some app DNA testing, which I thought was smart at the time. You'll see why in a moment. But they actually found that they could install a lot of applications right away to 2016, and there was a couple other applications that weren't working so well, so they kept those on 2008 R2 until they could figure it out. But anyway, during this process this week, they actually did some testing with the application owners. They were actually able to do that in a safe kind of way, and so that actually was kind of fun to see. Now we get to the driving to drink kind of of part of the presentation and talking about just how bad this can go. So this place just had a scrum one day and decided that it was time to do this upgrade. And during the scrum, it was asked, okay, how long will this take? And the server administrator who had knew Citrix well enough, but he was just put there in that position not too long before that. He kind of scratched his head and said, I think about a week is what it'll take. And so they put down a week in their board, and so that was what it ended up being, right? So that's just the plan, right? So they actually went to work right away. They started doing a migration and figured out that we could just do this right in place, and so that's what they decided to do right from pretty much day one. Now they did some proper things. They did some change control and things like that and declared that, but they went ahead and just upgraded their servers to the new, and then found out that there's some apps that wouldn't work. So they had actually done a few of the 2008 servers just kept as 2008 R2. So same scenario, right? Now at the time this was supported, but some of the apps now would be much more of a challenge, but at the time it was fully supported, so they decided to just run with it. Now, I'm sure this company has probably dealt with it. Well, hopefully they've dealt with this by now. But anyway, day 5 into their deployment, they decided to go ahead and start the VMware upgrade process. They attached the new storage, moved everything over, created the new environment, went ahead with all the things they needed to do, and over the weekend decided to roll out the new VDAs and everything like that to the new environment. So seems easy enough, right? Let's go back to our good company. We'll take a break and say we're now at day 12, and they're into that kind of pre-production phase of evaluating how the testing went, and they identified that there's some things about the 2016 apps worked that had some issues printing, and so they had to go kind of back to that planning phase and say, okay, what are we going to do, and engage the vendors and figured out there's a solution, and then retested, revalidated, said, okay, we need to make a change to our design. So they made the change to their design document and went forward, and so they had their user acceptance tested scheduled by day 16. Good stuff. Back to the bad. So they have a storage issue. But the migration isn't really possible at this point because they've already upgraded their core, their hypervisors. They did an in-place upgrade. These aren't new hardware, so they're kind of stuck at this point. They can't take their entire system offline to do this, and so everything just goes down. P1 incident, down all day. They had it resolved by the end of the day, fortunately, but still had a whole day of drama. But everything seems to be okay. By about day 9, they start to see a lot of chasing around of issues. There's lots of poor performance, that sort of thing, and the staff is overwhelmed very, very quickly. 2 days later, they're calling the vendor to see, hey, what do we do about this? And they ask if rollback is possible, and they say no, it isn't possible at this point. So it continues to go bad from here. After 3 days chasing the issues, the CIO basically has that, the come to Jesus meeting is what I've heard it said here in the South. I'm not originally from the South, but that's South US. We have that come to Jesus meeting. And the CIO says, okay, what are we doing here? This is not working. We need this done, fixed right away. Just do whatever it takes to fix it, and they're just adamant and emotional and, threatening and all that kind of stuff. They're especially pissed off that nothing can be rolled back, and they're just stuck with what they have and they have to make it work. So given that, What happened in this case is that after days and days and days of struggling with this, and between, ticket after ticket, finally doing some research and figuring out that there's a blog post out there that seems to be the solution. And they just, I guess, weren't thinking. They were in that emotional state. They knew the CIO was really, really pissed off. And so they just made this change. They said, this is probably going to work. And that change disruption, it made another disruption for 3 hours, made things much worse in that regards. The changes rolled back, and they're still stuck after several weeks. Now, back to the good. The good is good. They're doing UAT testing now. They're actually, they find a performance problem actually, and so they just say, okay, well, let's put you guys back on the regular production. We're going to go back to this and see what's up, and found out that there was a storage issue. Sounds familiar, right? So they just corrected, they fixed the glitch. So UAT was the only possible bit of outage, and about an hour of downtime for that small group of people. That's the extent of the outage they experienced, basically. So they resound, found no issues, but found that performance still wasn't quite as good. So they did some automated load testing, and found that there were some elements that they needed to change as far as their numbers, as far as going into kind of more technical part of this, like how many users can you have on a physical host, that sort of thing, scalability. And so they made some determinations there that they needed to change that, and placed an order for the new hardware so that it can be ready. And basically said, okay, while we're waiting for this, let's do some documentation, that sort of thing, and kind of went forward the smart kind of way. But here's what they did that was really smart. They trained their service desk on what to expect. So they knew that they were going to get a lot of calls because things were changing as far as appearance. There's, things they needed to watch out for, if this, then that kind of scenarios. And so they trained their service desk on what to expect and how to properly escalate issues or deal with any issues. Then they spent 14 days, 2 weeks, actually giving a message about the rollout to the pilot and the overall what's coming to everybody. They messaged us out and did a marketing campaign to their entire company. Did a pilot with about 500 of 2,000 users, which that's probably a good way to do that, like as far as an actual production pilot. And the load started to show degraded performance in a single application. So everything else is going fine. So they decided to go ahead and continue the pilot, as it wasn't really impacting big production thing. It was just a performance thing. But they did go ahead and reinitiate the process of figuring out, okay, what can we do about this? And somebody suggested adding Citrix Workspace Environment Manager, which solved the issue. So they went through the validation process with UAT and rolled that part of it out. So, boom. Then they get the bad, and this is where things get really bad, folks, really bad. So management was reluctant to do anything as far as changes and had no confidence at this point in the team. And so they just suspended what they were doing. They just stopped, said, okay, you're done, and don't make any more changes, nothing more. Hired a consulting group to come in, this guy. And of course, with anything, we're in a busy field. IT consultants are busy. We can't just drop what we're doing and come service you. So that in this case, there was a waiting period of when I could actually be available, when the team could be available. It's 2 months in other delays. So the environment was limping along for this whole time. Users were not happy. No amount of donuts will help this situation. Come back to the good IT rollout, and you have a nice clean production. New hardware arrives, so it's even better. We're ready to go with production. Everything is tested out. It's good. We migrate all the users over, and in day 80, the production rollout, this actually happened. Production rollout while their Citrix architect was on vacation. This actually happened. Hard to believe, but it actually did. He didn't get a single call. Everything went fine. He came back and everything was great. So as far as that goes, from that point down, they're already in maintaining it, day 90. So they do some monitoring, obviously, they put in a good vendor and did that. And then some interviews they conducted after the fact, they actually determined that their users were actually getting better than they were getting before, which I don't know how many of you have done a 2008 to 2016 upgrade. That's usually not the case. Usually there's little glitches here and there if you're using the same hardware. So good on them. So they did that right. Come back to the bad. It's now 120 days in, and the consultants do a quick assessment and find, you know what, there's some things we need to change here and make some policy changes. They actually, stopped. I say they, I mean me, actually stopped the person midstream during the conversation we were having about this, because they started to actually make the changes in production, and we stopped them. Said, no, we're going to test this first. And so we actually helped them with their process in that. And like just with the other place, they need new hardware and stuff like that. So that was all ordered as well. So over the course of the next 30 days, put it all into place, and it's back to pretty much what was anticipated. Fixed all the things, but didn't change the fact that the CIO was had a resume generating opportunity here. So they were asked to step down, and he knew it was coming and fired everybody else. It was a tragedy. Even the partner got fired for this, actually. Again, donuts are not good enough to keep your job if you're doing a bad job. So what went right, what went wrong? So the deployment plan for the good department was 60 days. They didn't even meet that. It was actually 90 days. So you'd think that'd be a bad thing. But about 50 users having a disruption for an hour, and that was the only actual disruption to their workflows the entire time. It's pretty good. No jobs lost. Completely on budget, because their time frame didn't mean that people were sitting around doing nothing or just being charged for nothing. They're just waiting for new hardware. So their time frame was the same. They were right on budget. So the vacation to donut ratio, absolutely on point. The bad department, however, had a plan of 7 days. Took them 210 days. That doesn't match up very well. They had 3 complete outages for well over 2,000 users. Users hate them. IT sucks, Citrix sucks, all this kind of stuff. People losing their jobs, exceeded budget, losses. I think there was lawsuits involved, I'm pretty sure. In other words, unemployment is vacation, right? Here's a quote from a friend of mine. I've never really attributed this properly, but I'm pretty sure he said this. I'm going to quote him anyway. In 6 months, no one will remember when we went live. They'll remember how we went live. And remember one thing today. That's the key to get into your brains is like sometimes faster is not better. The method actually is good. So a couple closing thoughts, and we'll just answer any questions you guys have. So I think we're to that point. Squeaky wheel IT just doesn't really work. You need to have a process in place, and management that understands your process well enough to stave off those kind of loudmouth requests kind of things. Nobody's impressed with your big complicated words and your big complicated impressive process. Sorry. Don't be a jerk. Don't be the guy or the gal that's doing what they want and just making it so that everybody has to follow along with them. IT services, they don't do well with minimum viable product. The first do no harm thing, even if it is, management said doing it right now, ops, that's not really great. Management doesn't always know what's best for your environment. Sometimes you have to be a little bit willing to stand up for your users and say, hey, I know you want this in a week, but you know what? It's probably not going to happen. So stand up for your users, and they'll stand up for you. In other words, it's not your knowledge, it's your methods. So here's what's happening with me. I'm actually doing a book on this, if you can't tell. We're going to throw the book at people. And so this is what's going on. We're actually in the process of doing a proofreading thing. And so I'm recruiting a launch team that's still open for the next, I think, 2 weeks. We'll probably keep this open. So if you there's a way to do this here. I don't know if this is, I'm hoping this is still working. We're going to find out today. So if anybody is in the US or text that, that's probably possible. But you can just go to it.justdothis.net, and there's a button there to click the launch team, and you can do that, or just send me an email at that address, the dj@methodologybook.com. That works too. Some ways you can connect with me. I don't know if you guys know this, but you actually can do a little QR code with LinkedIn these days. And so if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn right now, you can just do this on your phone and grab that connection. So I'll leave that up on the screen. So good stuff. Awesome. Any questions? I haven't been keeping a good track of this. No questions?
I only see price, DJ. I only see price. You
Hey, I love that.
enjoyed that. Nice session.
Good. I'm glad. I always wonder if this is going to resonate with people or not, or if this is, I know there's people that get kind of pissed off about this kind of stuff and think that their way is the right way, and you know what, they're probably right. But yeah, it's good to see it.
Right. There's a question: can we buy this book in Netherlands?
It will be available in the Netherlands, yes. And there's going to be some different methods to do that, I guess. But that's always the fun thing when you're relying on. I was relying on Amazon for my first launch, which had some quirks, more worldwide audience than I thought I would. But if it doesn't work with Amazon, then I have a secondary partner that we're working with, and we're actually hoping if we get enough of kind of momentum with this, then it'll actually be available in bookstores as well. But that one's a little bit tougher because I'm self-publishing. So, but not impossible.